get going. We have a good amount of people here. Welcome to the AREUEA online seminar series. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Andra Ghent, who's going to present her paper, her co-author paper, Winners and Losers from Work from Home Technology Boom. So the way that we'll structure this seminar is feel free to raise your hand if you have a clarifying question while Andra is giving her presentation. And you can also put comments and questions in the chat. We have some co-authors here, so they'll be able to man the chat a little bit. And if there's any chat questions that need to be elevated up to Andra, I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. So I think we'll give it away to Andra here. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks so much for organizing, Louise and Lindsay. And Lindsay, thanks for hosting. And thanks to all of you for joining us. So this is joint work with Mo Davis and Jesse Gregory. They are both online manning the chat, so feel free to ask questions there. Or if you raise your hand, I will answer directly during the talk. So this paper, there's a lot of notation that I'm going to show you. There's a lot of decisions, but the basic idea is really very straightforward. It's very intuitive. And the basic idea is that there are some workers that are going to be able to take advantage of the improvement in work from home productivity over the course of the pandemic. And there are some that are not. But unlike most forms of skill-biased technological change, the improvement in work from home technology increases a particular demand, which is for housing. And because housing is inelastically supplied, we're going to find that this has differential effects on different sort of workers. So we're going to look at how this technology improvement affects the welfare of different types of workers. So the model is going to specify that workers are exogenous in their occupation and their skill level. And workers are going to have, some workers are going to have the option to be 100% on site, so 5 days a week, or they could work a hybrid schedule. And then there's going to be another set of workers that can choose either of those two work options, but they can also choose to be 100% remote. So they can live in a different city than where their employer is located. Hereafter, we're going to just call these workers remote. So when I use the term remote, I mean fully remote. All workers are going to choose in which city to live. Housing is going to be an input into the production of work from home. And again, the two key elements of the model here are that everybody has to consume housing. It's not like peanut butter. It's not like pasta. There's no option to not consume housing. The second key element is that housing is inelastically supplied. Those are really the key sort of elements of the model that are going to give the results. We're then going to calibrate the model to pre-pandemic data on the 30 largest US cities. And then we're able to use the model to study the effects of a large increase in the total factor productivity of work from home. So what we find, the improvement in work from home technologies, first just as a check on, is the model giving us anything quantitatively realistic? And what we find is that there's a 16% increase in residential rents in the model, long run. What we see in the data is about 14%. So we actually slightly overpredict this. Just keep in mind that these are real rents. So if you're looking at nominal appreciation in rents, you might seem that this might seem small, but we're looking at inflation adjusted rents. And then we find a 12% decrease in office rents in the model long run. In the data, after we control for lease characteristics, we see about 11 to 13%. So we're spot on office rents. We a little bit overpredict residential rents. There's an increase in measured income for all worker types. The biggest increase in welfare, though, is actually for remote capable workers. And what they're not seeing quite the same size increase in their incomes as the hybrid workers, but what the increase in total factor productivity allows them to shift to remote work, and they really like being able to work remote. They get a big utility benefit from being remote, even if it doesn't increase their wages that much. What we find most importantly, I think, is that there's actually a welfare loss for workers in non-telecommutable occupations. And again, what's going on here is they're stuck with these higher housing costs. They didn't get a big increase in their productivity. They didn't get any increase in their total factor productivity, and they have to consume housing. That's not an option. Again, it's not like peanut butter. It's not like pasta. It's not like restaurant meals. You don't have an option whether to consume it. The biggest loss in welfare is actually for college-educated workers in non-telecommutable occupations. So this might seem a little surprising, but what's going on here is they actually, not only they see these higher housing prices, they see a loss in total factor productivity from lower agglomeration economies. So the intuition is these skilled workers are more productive when they come in, the more other skilled workers are coming into the city every day. And so when less people are coming into the city, that actually makes them less productive. Just like if you think, well, is there any point of going into the office when I know only 2 colleagues are going to be there for lunch? Obviously, that doesn't have the same spillovers as if 8 colleagues are there for lunch. And the welfare loss comes despite measured income increasing slightly. So the cheaper office rents actually means that labor productivity, not total factor productivity, but labor productivity for the non-telecommutable workers increases slightly. And there's a slightly higher labor supply because given our functional forms, the shorter commutes that people face mean that they actually increase their labor supply just a little bit. So we're building.
Andra, can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
I'm sure you will elaborate on it, but for these workers that go fully remote, that you say they're getting the highest gain in welfare. So is that coming from preferences that they just like being home, or is it coming because they are paying lower housing prices because they can move far away?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually, and I don't, it's more in the paper than in that I talk about the model, but it's mostly actually that they just get this utility benefit. They don't have vastly different sorting patterns than workers that are still tied to the city of their employer. When you kind of look in the data, they don't seem to be, they're a little more mobile, but not vastly more mobile. I don't think I have all the, I maybe would put it in the next presentation, but if you look in the paper, we have some sort of experiments where we kind of look, where do they seem to locate? And we don't see vast differences in where they locate. So they are choosing slightly cheaper cities, you're right, to a slightly greater degree than other workers, but that's not the big increase in
That's
their.
not what's driving it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what we could do to get at this question, we have an experiment where we keep kind of everybody in the same city. And we could more precisely, I think, get at your question by not having the remote workers move at all to see how much that changes things. I don't think it's going to change very much, but we could get more, we could give a more precise answer to your question if we did that experiment. I think that's right, Mo and Jesse? Jesse and Mo might have another thought on how we can get to that.
Let's talk after the seminar.
Okay, perfect. This is why we get feedback. Okay, so we are building on these existing models, spatial models of work from home, as well as the productivity models of work from home. What's new in this paper is that it increases not just inequality. So in our previous paper, we found that a big increase in inequality, but it actually lowers welfare. And then we think we make a slight modeling contribution because in the previous paper, we only had hybrid and on-site workers. Now we have remote workers as well. And I think people who don't work in urban don't really think, well, what's the difference between remote and hybrid? It's just more work from home. But the difference is that the remote workers, again, they can choose to live in a completely different city from their employer. So that could have big implications for city structure. We don't in practice find that it makes a big difference to the overall model. Okay, so the model is an urban model with work from home. All office work occurs in the central business district, and you have to commute to do it. Work from home does not require a commute. And there's 5 types of workers, and these are exogenous. So first type of worker is called our type 1, and they are high-skilled workers, and they work in telecommutable occupations. Second type of worker, low-skilled workers in telecommutable occupations. Third type of worker is a high-skilled worker that can't telecommute because of their occupation. Fourth is low-skilled workers that can't telecommute by occupation. And then our fifth type of worker is our tech workers. And so kind of when we look around, anecdotally, it seems like the most capable occupations to be fully remote are these tech workers, and that's going to be our type 5 workers. Housing supply is exogenous and inelastic. So households are going to make a sequence of decisions. The very first set of decisions is only available to our type 5 households. And they are going to choose whether or not to be remote. If they choose not to be remote, they become what we call ilk 5. So iota is going to stand for your ilk. If they choose to be remote, they're going to be ilk 6. So our ilk again is indexed by iota, and for type 1 through 4, iota, your ilk is the exact same thing as your type. Again, these fully remote workers are making a first decision before they choose which city to live in. They choose whether or not to be remote. And our intuition for this sequencing is that, again, we want to decouple the decision of where to live, which city to live in, from your employer. And so once you've chosen to be fully remote, you can choose whichever city you want to live in. So your type is exogenous, then you choose, if you're remote, whether or not to, if you're remote capable, whether to actually be remote, and then you choose which of these cities to live in. The next decision you make is which of N zones to live in. And zones are basically either near the city center or far from the city center, like a suburb, basically. And then if you are either ilk 1, 2, or 5, so these are our workers in telecommutable occupations, as well as our tech workers that have chosen to not be fully remote, they choose whether to work for a firm that allows hybrid work. And we're going to call such firms hybrid firms. Kappa equals 0 denotes a non-work from home firm, and kappa equals 1 denotes a hybrid firm. Finally, all ilks are going to choose non-housing consumption and housing. Then households that choose hybrid firms, they're also going to choose the number of days to work from home in the year, the size of their home office, and the amount of business equipment for the home office. Okay, so type 5, how do they make this remote decision? So V6 is the expected value of choosing to be remote, and V5 is the expected value of choosing not to be remote. So a given household J that is type 5 decides whether or not to be remote by choosing the max of 2 things. So they have this idiosyncratic preference at E hat 6J or E hat 5J, and those are specific to household J. And then A hat is a utility benefit you get. Notice that A hat is only applicable to if you choose to be this remote worker, and it's going to pin down the average fraction of type 5 workers that choose to be remote. And then VR is going to determine the elasticity of this choice with respect to changes in the value function. Okay, so there's both sort of an average utility benefit of being fully remote, and then there's this idiosyncratic preference for that. Then V iota C is the expected value of ilk iota living in city C. And again, you're going to choose the city to maximize your expected utility, where there's again each city is going to offer an amenity bundle. And that is going to pin down the average population by type in each metro area. And then new C is going to pin down the elasticity of city choice in response to changes in the differential of economic fundamentals across city. And then again, there's going to be an idiosyncratic, so specific to household J, shock that gives you utility from living in city C. And for each ilk, we are going to denote the expected value of this decision before the E tildes are drawn as V iota. Okay. Then you're going to make a decision about where within the city to live. So again, you're going to have, again, an idiosyncratic preference for location and these are these zones again. So you should think of this, again, you're deciding whether to live in Manhattan or whether you're deciding to live in northern New Jersey. That's the sort of decision you're making. And there's again going to be the importance of these idiosyncratic location preferences relative to the fixed utility each location gives you is determined by new. And then within each city, there is an amenity associated with each zone. So if you live in Manhattan, you may have amenities associated with higher quality restaurants. If you live in New Jersey, you may have amenities associated with less traffic, something like that. Okay.
Andra,
Now-
each location has an associated distance to the central business district,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
It also has a distance, and that's going to be reflected in commute time. So the traffic, I maybe that wasn't a good example. The sort of noisiness is what I'm sort of capturing. We're going to have separate. Be patient on the commuting because you're exactly right, Louise. Depending on if you live in northern New Jersey, you're going to face higher commute time as well as higher pecuniary commuting costs. Okay, now you're going to decide what type of firm do I want to work for. And again, your choice, if you are in a telecommutable occupation, is whether to work for a firm that allows hybrid work or a firm that does not allow hybrid work. So kappa equals 0 you have to be on site 5 days a week. Kappa equals 1 allows some work from home. And then again, you're going to have idiosyncratic preferences for this. And 1 over zeta determines the importance of this firm type preference. And just be a little patient on this deterministic component x n iota c to the power of kappa. I told you there's a lot of notation. We got to keep track of all these decisions. But again, the basic intuition of the model hopefully is pretty straightforward. Okay. Now this is a pretty straightforward model, very standard if you choose a non-work from home firm. So you're going to choose consumption at this point. So this 0 superscript indicates that you have chosen to work for a firm that requires 5 days a week in person. So you're going to choose your consumption, your housing, your leisure, and the fraction of time to spend working, B, to maximize your utility from consumption, housing, and then leisure. And you face 2 constraints. You face a budget constraint. That's this first line here, where this is your wage. So W superscript 0 is the wage, minus this is your pecuniary commuting cost. So if you live in northern New Jersey, you have to buy a transit pass or you have to pay for parking in the city, as the case may be. And that is dependent on the fraction of time you spend working. And that's your net wages. And then here's your consumption and here's your housing. So everybody rents housing in this model. So nobody owns housing. Everybody's going to rent in this model. So you rent housing at a cost of RNC. So again, N is your zone, C is your city. The second constraint you face is on your time. You're endowed with 1 unit of time, and you're going to split this between time you spend working, and that includes commuting costs. So all the time you spend working, you have to pay this TNC. So it's going to be specific to where you live, how much time you have to spend commuting, and then your leisure. Okay, if you choose a hybrid firm, you're going to make choices to maximize this X1. So again, the 1 is the superscript that denotes you're at a hybrid firm. And your utility benefit, your fixed kind of average, a common preference for being at a work from home firm, depends on your type. Okay, so it could be the case that a college educated worker gets the different utility benefit from being at a hybrid firm relative to 100% in person than a non-college educated worker. And then they also get utility from non-housing consumption, from housing consumption, and from leisure. The difference here from the workers that choose to be 100% on site is now their wages are a function. It's not a fixed level, it's a function, and it's going to depend on a few things. First is your split, how much time you spend in the office, that's LB, and then how much time you spend working at home, that is LH. And then it also depends on how much home office space you have and how much business equipment you have at home. So you are free to choose a mix of whatever mix you want of hybrid, but it's going to get reflected in your wage. Similarly, you are free to work, you and your spouse in a studio apartment in Manhattan, and both of you work from home. But if you're less productive doing that because you don't have adequate space, that's going to get reflected in your wage. Now you pay this pecuniary commuting cost only on the amount of time you work at the office. You don't pay it on both your work from home and your time at the office, only on your time at the office. And then, you take out your consumption, and now you're renting not just your housing for consumption, but the housing you'd use as an input into your work from home production. So you rent space to work from home as well as to consume. And then this is your business equipment, which you're also renting.
This pecuniary cost varies according to the zone, right? That's the
It does, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So if you live in Manhattan and can walk from work, that's going to be reflected in the difference in Tau N. That's exactly right. Yeah. Or, in most cities, most other American cities, the mode of getting to work is, of course, to drive. And if you put less wear and tear on your car and spend less in gas, that also gets reflected in that Tau N. Your time constraint is similar to what you had before, but now your time cost of commuting is only paid on the labor you supply going into the office. You save that time cost for any day you work from home. And then, of course, this is just your leisure. Okay, if you are a remote worker, you produce output. So 6, again, denotes that you've chosen to be fully remote. And you have a Cobb-Douglas production function where this is your labor input, this is your business equipment, and this is your space that you use. And then your TFP is Z6, which is going to differ depending on which city you're in. And you're going to make these choices to maximize non-housing consumption, housing consumption, and leisure. What are your budget constraints? Well, you don't have any time. You don't have any cost of commuting at all, right? Because you work from home. But you divide your time between work and leisure. And then this is your budget constraint. So your output, you're going to earn your output. That's your wage. And then here's your consumption. And then you, again, just like the hybrid workers, you're renting the space that you use to produce your work from home, as well as your housing for consumption. And then again, you rent your business equipment. And then this is just saying that your output has to be equal to this production function. Okay, non-work from home firms. These guys are actually pretty straightforward. They choose their quantities of labor and capital in the form of both equipment and software to maximize profits. So this is their output. Again, it's a Cobb-Douglas production function where the TFP is specific to the city and the type. And they are going to maximize their output net of what they have to pay for wages, rent, and business equipment. Okay, hybrid firms. A firm that hires a household living in location N of type iota, and iota is going to be 1, 2, or 5. This is the key sort of element of the last paper where we specify that work from home is not a perfect substitute for work at the office. And our intuition for modeling it that way is when we look in the data pre-pandemic, you see that most days of work from home were not being produced, not being supplied by households that were 100% remote. Most of them were actually being provided by households that did a little bit of work from home, but were mostly on site. So that was the sense that, they're not perfect substitutes. And so that gives the rise to hybrid work. And so these are in a CS production function. So you take the output YB is the output produced at the office, and YH is the work from home output. And these are combined using the CS aggregator. And what we actually find in our previous paper is that the estimates we can reject rho being less than 1, so they're not perfect substitutes, and we actually find a value of that parameter. Okay, so these hybrid firms, I told you that they combine work from home and work at the office, and both of the output of work at the office is Cobb-Douglas in these 3 inputs: labor at the office, business equipment at the office, and space at the office, and it has a TFP. Okay, so its TFP is AB, and then work from home output also has a TFP AH, and then again, it depends on output. It depends on your labor supply for work from home, the space you rent for work from home in your home office, and then business equipment at home. And so now you can sort of see what I mean when I said, well, households, their wages are going to be reflective of the amount of space they rent and the amount of business equipment they rent, because you can see that if this was very low, if SH is very low, your output of your output of work from home is very low. So they take into account the impact on their wages that comes from the differential productivity. We're going to assume firms are competitive and households own the firm. Okay, so TFP at home. Again, the key parameter here, AH, and this is what we think really changed during the pandemic, is that this AH increased significantly during the course of pandemic. So why do we have so much more work from home now than we did in 2019? It's because there was a big rise in AH. And the reason is down to an adoption externality. So AH depends on some fixed parameter, A bar H, and you can think of this as the existing level of technology. So does high-speed internet exist? Does does some stuff like Zoom or Skype or Microsoft Teams exist? We don't think that changed a lot during the course of the pandemic. What we think changed is the maximum amount of time that households in aggregate spent working at home in any previous year. And delta iota is going to tell us the extent of the adoption externality. This is a little different from a network externality, which is the more classic thing you see in agglomeration economies, right? Where how productive I am in a city depends on how many other people live in the city at the same time. The reason we think that is that now that we're down to, 1 or 2 or 3 days of work from home, as opposed to 5 days of work from home during the pandemic, we didn't seem to lose the ability to use Zoom. We all are still as productive or close to as productive as we were when we were doing 5 days a week. That's why we don't think it's quite the same as a network externality. Okay, TFP at the office. Agglomeration economies in production are only going to happen for high-skilled workers. And there's a lot of empirical evidence to support this assumption. So non-work from home firm TFP is going to depend on the total high-skill household time working at the office in City C during this period. So that's math cal H, if you will. And then hybrid firm TFP while at the office is going to depend on the same total high-skill household time working at the office. Notice that there's no agglomeration economies for low-skilled households. And that's going to be important for the welfare benefits later, because it hurts the high-skilled workers in non-telecommutable occupations more, because they're also taking this hit to their TFP by all these people working from home. Okay, TFP of remote workers. We had to be a little heroic here thinking how to model this. So, there's a question of like, if you're a tech worker and you choose to live in Oklahoma City, are you as productive as a tech worker that lives in San Francisco or Austin? I think the answer is probably no, but we didn't really know how to parameterize this. So what we chose to do is that if you are the tech worker living in City C, you're going to get a weighted average of the national average productivity of on-site type 1 workers. So some TFP is inherited from the city. That's the lambda Z1C, and some is inherited from the nation as a whole. I think it's a really interesting question, what this actually is. And I think a lot of employers would like to know, if they see a tech worker that moves to Oklahoma City, how much less productive are they going to be over the long term? But we don't really know this right now. And then phi is a discount factor representing the extent to which remote workers are less productive than their hybrid counterparts. Commuting speed.
Andra,
Yeah.
sorry, another question. Is there any reason to think, because the way I think about that is you become more productive from these spillovers and communication when you go to the office. If you're not in the office, why would it matter if I live in San Francisco or Oklahoma City, right? Are you saying there are still connections or knowledge that you can gather from non-work colleagues that are local?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think you have the exactly right intuition. There's the paper, I think it's Ardar, I want to say JPE, that's looking at these serendipitous connections that people make in like coffee shops. So there's a question here about, agglomeration economies internal to the firm and external to the firm. And there's not really a distinction in our model, but I think that there is a question of like, if you're just around a lot of really skilled workers and you're having these conversations at dinner parties, you're having this conversation at daycare pickup, like you're having these conversations that are sort of in the air, that aren't necessarily at the firm. And my intuition is that these matters, especially this Sarah, I think they changed the name of the paper. It's in our references, but I do think there is some benefit. It's not just it's hard for me to believe that if you're sitting in Oklahoma City and everybody else around you is not that well educated and they're just not the same sort of quality of worker as when you see them in San Francisco, it's hard for me to believe there's no spillovers from that. Does that answer your question, Luis?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But I
Thanks.
think it's an open question, like what these weights are. And you'll notice that it's not dependent on the city of the employer. And that's another, we didn't model it that way, but you might think that it could depend on the city of the employer a little bit. But we didn't model it that way.
And I think this could be explaining the point that you raised at the beginning, which is that you don't observe people really moving away from their local cities as was expected. When the pandemic just hit, there was this whole narrative about people just moving to the Midwest from New York, from larger cities, because it didn't make sense to pay higher rents now, and you don't see that anymore, even while remote work continues to be high.
Yeah, so okay, you do bring up something. What we saw in the data overall is significantly more mobility post-pandemic than in the years pre-pandemic. And we had to allow city amenities to change pre-pandemic to post-pandemic to match that. But it doesn't seem to be much more pronounced for remote workers than for hybrid workers. It seems kind of weird, and we don't have a good explanation for this, but it's like everybody sort of, your non-remote workers, your remote workers, your hybrid workers, they all seem to kind of wake up and be like, I don't know that it still makes sense to pay San Francisco rents. But it doesn't seem to be primarily about remote workers. Does that make sense? Like there seems to be something going on with increased mobility. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, the way we're going to match that in the data is just allowing city level amenities to change, because we couldn't really get at that another way. But I think it's a really interesting question. What changed that people reevaluated the utility benefits? And maybe it is true that just San Francisco got like much worse in consumption amenities, but we don't really, we can't really explain that completely. Okay, then commuting speed. It is true that when fewer people are coming into the CBD, there's less traffic and you go faster. So we have a way of measuring that. And of course, that's going to be specific to the zone as well as the city. Okay, at equilibrium in this.
Give me 1 second.
Okay, an equilibrium in this economy is a set of rents. So for office space, RO is office space. RNC is residential space. RK is business equipment. There's a wage rate for each ilk of worker working at a non-work from home firm in each city. A wage function. Again, if you are a hybrid worker, the choices you make about the split of your time between home and office, as well as how much space you rent and business equipment you rent, gets reflected in your wage. For each ilk of worker choosing to work at a hybrid firm, and then commute times for each location in each city. Okay, all households have to be optimizing. All firms are optimizing. And then the total demand of housing, inclusive of home office space in each location, is equal to the supply of housing in each location. And then total demand for office space is also going to be equal to the supply of office space. And then finally, the quantities in each city are consistent with the externalities that affect all wages and commute times. So the externalities, again, are these agglomeration economies, as well as the commuting externalities. Okay, matching model concepts to the data. We're going to parameterize the model as close as possible to immediately before COVID. High-skilled workers mean workers with a 4-year college degree. In the model, all workers are going to be full-time workers, so we restrict to full-time workers. Our telecommutable occupations are those that Dingle-Nyman have determined are telecommutable. Type 5 workers are just IT workers. And then there's 2 residential zones. So zone 1 is the same county as the CBD. Zone 2 is all other counties in the same metro area. And then we're going to estimate the model using the data on the largest US cities, the 30 largest. Okay, so for some parameters, we're going to use values from other studies. And then for other parameters, we match the data with a single moment in the data. Our main data set is the 2015 to 2019 5-year ACS. Why do we like this data? It has a large sample size and the ability to observe the county. But we supplement with a special module of the American Time Use Survey called the Leave and Job Flexibility module and the General Social Survey. What this gives us is a lot more detail on the intensity of work from home. So a lot of you probably know at this point that the only measure you get of work from home in the ACS is whether the usual commute mode is no commute. And that misses all this detail on sort of how much work from home you do. So you would see that you don't see that split between hybrid and remote. You just see you're primarily remote or you're not remote at all. And so we want to know that hybrid split. And that's where we get the leave and job flexibility. That's where we use the LJF and the GSS. I have a little bit, we go till 10:15. Is that right, Lindsay? We go, yeah. So I think
Yes.
12:15. Okay, so I can talk a little bit about how we calibrate the model. So our city-specific TFP is inferred from pre-pandemic ACS wages stripped of demographics. The relative TFP of work from home and work in the office for hybrid workers, how we calibrate that is we match the share of workers choosing to be hybrid and work from home intensity with the experimental wage discounts that Mass and Pillay report that workers are willing to accept to be hybrid workers. Okay, this is again where we kind of have this lambda parameter. We have no knowledge of this parameter. So we're going to take that to be 0.5. Why not? We'd be very open to any evidence on, what the right value is this. Again, I think it's a really interesting question, but we just didn't have any evidence on this. So we just set this to 0.5. We do have evidence on the discount, though, that workers are willing to take to be remote relative to fully in person. And that we're going to take from this experimental evidence by David Newmark and his co-authors. So workers are willing to accept a big discount. If you compare fully in person versus fully remote, they're willing to accept about a 36% discount. And then these are all kind of boring. You know, there are not a lot of disagreement on this. Rents. So the one thing that might be worth noting is office rents. We take as effective rents, so after adjusting for concessions from CompStack, and then residential rents per square foot are imputed from Realtor.com county level prices per square foot. Notes on city type amenity parameters. So again, we're going to allow these to change pre versus post pandemic. But, you know, it's maybe not super surprising that St. Louis and Dallas are very low amenity cities. And then the San Diego, Miami, Phoenix, Boston's, those are the very high amenity cities. Oh, let me go back here. Okay, post-pandemic counterfactuals. So you can think of this as like 2023 if you want, maybe 2024, that short run. Here, the supply of space is fixed to our baseline in the central business district, zone 1 and zone 2. Prices are going to do all the adjusting. And we calibrate the technological improvement over the pandemic for hybrid workers to the values in our previous paper. And what we're calibrating here is what gives a 4-fold increase in the days of work from home for types 1 and 2. And then we actually take our increase in the TFP of remote work such that we go from about 12% of tech workers being fully remote in 2019 to 51% of workers being fully remote in 2022. And maybe 2023 would give a different picture, but that's the most recent data we had when we wrote this draft. And then again, we're going to allow city-specific amenity values to change to match the population changes by ilk between 2019 and 2022 in the one-year ACS. The main difference between our short run and long run is that the supply elasticities are such that we allow increases in residential space in zones 1 and 2. And then we're going to set the supply elasticity of office space to 0.1. So space adjusts. Prices don't come down completely. That's the key because it's inelastic. Okay, so what we find, and this is again in our previous work, we find that there was a big increase in the relative productivity of work from home. So in our pre-COVID baseline, the TFP of work from home relative to work in the office was only 0.36, and it increases to about 0.66. And then for type 2 workers, it increases from 0.35 to about 0.52. So big increase in the relative TFP for both types of workers. Notice that this is not, it's a little tricky to interpret because of the CS aggregator. You don't want to say work from home is super unproductive because you still want to combine work from home and work at the office. It's just a matter of how many days you do of each. And this increase in TFP means you're going to increase both along the intensive margin. So workers that were already doing some work from home pre-pandemic are going to do more. And then you're also increasing along the extensive margin where workers that were 100% in person, more of them are choosing a hybrid firm. And that channel is actually more important for our low-skilled workers. And then fee, the relative TFP of remote work, increases by about 20% relative to the pre-pandemic value. Okay, the real change in office rents. So unlike residential real estate, there's far fewer transactions and more heterogeneity in office than residential. So we're going to measure the change in real office rents using this hedonic regression, where RIT is log of effective rents per square foot. So those of you who don't work on commercial real estate, effective rents just take into account the fact that rent may be cheaper in the first year than years 2 through 5, or it could be some period of free rent. And we're going to, so that's our effective rents per square foot. And we're going to regress that on a bunch of lease characteristics. That's our X. And so these include things like who pays the expenses? Is it the landlord or is it the tenant? Location fixed effects, the lease term, so how many years the lease is, as well as total transaction square footage. And then the key variable here is post work from home boon. So we want to see how much rents change. So beta post captures the change in office rents after controlling for lease characteristics. Okay, so what we find, and again, these are adjusted for inflation. It's whether we control for location effects only at the city level, or if we control for zip code level fixed effects, we still get something in the 12 to 14% range for the decline in real office rents. Similarly, if we control for what tenant what industry the tenant signing the leases in, very similar estimate. Gross means the landlord pays the expenses. Net means the tenant pays the expenses, and it doesn't seem to matter whether we use gross or net leases. Again, we're still pretty close to that 12% number. Similarly, it doesn't seem to matter whether we use only new leases, that's column 6, or we only look at renewals. We're still in sort of somewhere in that 12 to 14% range. And what do we get in the model? The model actually predicts something very close to that. You can see that the data is this dark green bar, and our model is basically, the data is somewhere between our short run and long run, which is reassuring. The residential rent changes. So the data, again, is the dark green bar, and overall residential space increases by about 14%. And that's going to be more pronounced in the suburbs than it is in the city center. So what's going on here is if you only have to commute to the office 2 days a week instead of 4 days a week or 5 days a week, you are willing to live further out into the suburbs. And so that increases the demand for zone 2 disproportionately. But there's also an increase in the demand for zone 1 because there's sort of two things going on. One is a location shift. More people want to be in the suburbs, but the second thing is an overall increase in the demand for residential space, because now you're getting demand for residential space for work from home. So that puts a lot of pressure on rents.
Andra, could you remind me, what are the things that are fixed in the short run in the model that are allowed to change in the long run?
Yeah, good question. So the big thing that's fixed in the short run is that there's been no increase in consumption. In construction. So the supply of space is fixed. So we haven't allowed any new construction. Does that make sense? Whereas in the long run, we allow construction according to the bomb, snow, and Hahn elasticities by zone. So that's the difference.
Got it.
Because these elasticities are actually pretty low, though, and that's sort of a key to the welfare results, you don't actually get that big a drop in rents between the short run and long run. So there's a lot of pressure in the short run, and it abates a little bit in the long run, but it doesn't come down to the previous level because space is pretty inelastic. That's if you look at these bomb, snow, and Hahn elasticities, you're talking like 0.2. I think our benchmark is 0.28 in one zone. I'd have to look, but it's well below 0.5 as the elasticity. So it's quite low. Welfare changes in the model. So again, we're looking short run versus long run. Everybody is better off in the long run because, again, you've had this increase in residential space. So in the short run, we're all stuck with these higher prices, and then it abates a little bit going into the long run. But type 1 is much better off. Type 2 gets a little bit of a benefit. They're a little bit more productive. And to just go back to what we were finding with the increase in TFP, part of the reason type 1 sees this bigger benefit is they saw a bigger increase in their TFP from the work from home technology boom, whereas the increase in TFP was a little smaller for these low-skilled workers. The low-skilled workers also have higher housing expenditure shares, so they're a little more hurt by this rise in house prices than the type 1 workers. Type 5, you see the biggest increase. Again, they're not necessarily, I'm going to show you wages in just a second, but a lot of what's going on here is more of them choose to be fully remote because they really value that in their utility. And then type 3 and 4, they're the ones hurt by the improvement in work from home TFP. So here's what's going on with income and consumption changes. So everybody's income goes up. The biggest increase in income is type 1 workers. Type 5 workers' income goes up a little, but not that much, because again, what they're doing is they're basically saying, I'm gonna like not take much of an increase in my wages, but I'm gonna work from home 100%. And that's why you don't see a huge increase for them. And then because of this rise in housing prices, everybody's housing consumption goes down. So the difference in the house, so what's going up is housing used for work from home. That's what's really changing. And then because non-housing consumption has gotten relatively cheaper, the non-housing consumption goes up for all workers type. But what you can see that's going on for type 3 and 4, they really have to reduce their housing consumption because they don't get a big increase in their income. So they really have to cut back on housing consumption. This is the same thing over the long run. Fairly similar patterns, but it's not quite as pronounced because, again, we've had an increase in housing supply over the long run relative to the short run. And this is just showing the difference between the short run and the long run. Okay, so what are the changes in income here? Again, all workers are going to see incomes rise. TFP rises for telecommutable types. There's a slight rise in labor supply because of a declining commuting costs. So leisure, given our functional form assumptions, leisure is going to be a constant in this model. And then so you did see an increase in wages for, where's my wages here? My income for my type 3 and 4. And what's going on, it's pretty small, but the intuition of what's going on is that they have, because office space has gotten so much cheaper, they have a little more office space to work with. And so that increases their labor productivity, not their TFP, but their labor productivity. Part of the rise in the income for telecommutable types is accounting. So workers are now renting home office space and business equipment out of their salary. So that's not quite the same as an overall increase in welfare, right? So the part of there's a bigger increase in income for telecommutable types than the rise in their actual consumption. But the biggest rise in income is definitely for type 1 workers. Type 5 income actually decreases between the short run and the long run because even more workers are switching to be remote, which means lower income. So you see an even bigger shift towards fully remote work. Changes in housing and non-housing consumption. Again, all workers consume less housing because more housing is used for work from home. The decline in housing consumption is a little more modest in the long run after housing supply has a chance to increase, but non-housing consumption rises because it's relatively cheaper and incomes rise. So again, just the recap of the whole paper, what should you take away? Take away that these fully remote workers, they're doing awesome. They are very lucky people. They are very happy. And they get this big utility benefit. Not necessarily, again, they're getting a small increase in their income. The bigger change is in their overall welfare. And the type 3 and 4 workers are hurt. And you can see that in the long run, the welfare loss is actually bigger for type 3 workers than type 4. And that's because they are becoming less productive in their TFP, given that fewer people are coming into the office. And so that hurts their agglomeration economy. Okay, so I think I'm actually a little bit ahead of time. I didn't have a lot of interruptions. I appreciate the interruptions I got. But what do you take away from this? Pandemic induced a large increase in the demand for residential space. It also increased the TFP of work from home because housing supply is inelastic and all households have to consume housing. Technological progress may have negative welfare consequences for some households. And so this is different from, again, the standard skill bias technology literature says income inequality increases, but it's not that your overall welfare goes down if you're a non-skilled household. In this model, welfare actually goes down because of the housing demand. Okay, questions?
Sorry, Andra, could you repeat that last conclusion again?
Yeah, so the standard kind of skill bias technological change literature finds an increase in inequality. what we actually find is it's saying that basically high income households see their incomes go up by significantly more than low income households see their income rise. But it doesn't imply standardly that you get a decrease in absolute welfare for the non-skilled households. The difference here is that because you have a good you have to consume, and that good is inelastically supplied, the increase in demand from all those other households for housing actually causes a absolute decrease in welfare for the type 3 and 4. Does that make sense, Luis?
Yeah. So
Okay.
so it is coming from some types and affecting the others through higher prices.
Exactly. And because, again, I think housing is sort of unique, and it's a unique sort of good in that we think people have to consume it, right? So again, it's not like, oh, big screen TVs, the price changed, or the price of restaurant meals changed. So it's because you have to consume this good. That's really what's driving it.
Right.
Okay, so if you have questions, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Go ahead, David.
So I found this paper very interesting, but I'd like to think a little bit about, let's say, urban, more European centers, where it would seem to me that office space and residential space can substitute between each other much more easily than, let's say, your numbers for the bomb snow and Han elasticities. And I wonder if in some long run of that sort, that some of these things would be undone. Some of your
Yeah, so I think you also bring up, so it's a good question. And maybe European cities do have higher housing supply elasticities. I'm suspicious of this because whenever I go to Europe, there's this big emphasis on like historic preservation. So I think that's the sort of like single family zoning of European cities, is this like intense emphasis on historic preservation, but I don't know of estimates. The second part of your question, I think, David, is the office to residential conversions. How feasible is this? We see a small number, a relatively small number in the US, and the sense is that they're about $200 per square foot when you can do them at all, because it has to be sort of light is an issue, plumbing is an issue, so they're quite expensive. And so we're not allowing that right now. I don't think that'd make a big difference in the US, but whether that's a bigger, I don't know. And you probably know better, David, whether that's a more, whether you're seeing more of those in European cities than you're seeing in the US, because we see some. I'm not saying we don't see any in the US, but it's relatively few. Or somebody else in Europe might know the answer. But that does that address? I essentially don't know the answers to your question, David, but if I had data, I would maybe have a better approach.
am I still audible?
Yes, you're
Yeah.
very
Yeah,
audible.
I don't know. Maybe somebody else knows. It just, I know there's sort of this American conception that there are people live in houses and sort of not apartments, and apartments can never be. And elsewhere, I mean, I think also in the United States, but one sees more of a substitution than our models sometimes admit. And I would think that in the long run, there would be more than that. In any case, I think it's something that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, next time I visit Europe, I will try to ask more about this. And about the housing supply elasticity. My general thought is, I think if I was going to guess, I think European cities have even lower housing supply elasticity just because they don't have any greenfield development options, right? So the US, where are you seeing housing supply? It's in these exurbs, these areas far from the cities centers, because that's where they don't have local resistance to adding housing supply. And it's relatively cheaper to do greenfield development than infill. Greenfield is just not an option in most of Europe because the land is already kind of all occupied. you don't have the same population pressures in Europe as you have in the US. So I think that's maybe why you haven't seen kind of quite the same rise in house prices. But it's an interesting question. I'd love to see more data on this.
Okay, Andy, go ahead.
Hi, Andra.
See ya.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So my understanding is that in this model, you've assumed that everyone's a renter, right? But we know
Yes.
that like 60% of people own homes, and like people who own homes, like the dynamic is a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
Because they're either going to take some part of their home and turn it into an office space, or they're going to want to move. But they've also, if they stay in the same place, they've already locked in what the cost of home ownership is, other than, other things are changing, right? So they're not subject to the change in supply or demand. Anyway, I was just wondering if you've thought through any of those
No,
dynamics, because they're really interesting, I think.
it's a really good question. So one of the couple things going on. What we don't have in the model is that this sort of like long-term liability in your housing demand. So if you're young, even if you're a homeowner, probably you're going to want to upsize as you sort of increase your income and as you have more children. And so even if, the fact that that cost rises, even if you're a homeowner, your overall liability may have increased more. The other way, though, to think about it, I think the very worst off households are your type 3 and 4 renters, right? Because they both their liability increased and they don't have any housing wealth, right? And so they have this big long-term increase in their liability. That unless we add more, we find some way of increasing the elasticity of supply, it does seem like the type 3 and 4 workers they have lower home ownership rates than the type 1 and 2, but the big pattern is age. So the really badly off people are actually young people. What we haven't done is sort of model that kind of your liability side. So again, you can think of sort of housing as like, yeah, it's an asset side if I own, but then I have this liability, which is my future demand for housing, right? This long-term stream. We haven't explicitly modeled that because the model doesn't have a dynamics. But I think what we can say for sure is, yes, for sure, the young households are worse off than the older households. Does that somewhat get at your question, Andy?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what I was saying, that the renters are going to be worse off than the homeowners or the people who are stretched into a home. So I guess it's young as also like growing family, where they didn't really have the space to create a work from home in the space that they had. They're sort of in a bad situation, other than the fact that that value of the home they had may have gone up. So at least they had some asset they could trade, but the renters would be in the worst position.
The absolute worst position. Yeah. Or even young homeowners. Mo has a thought on this that he can chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, to be fair to us, most urban models don't have wealth effects. Because to have wealth effects sort of requires a saving decision, and then to have a saving decision kind of requires dynamics. And so, and then even talk about like, yeah, of course, if you own a home and house prices go up, you're better off, but the future generation of home buyers is worse off. So then that's kind of what everyone talks about. Like, you'd have to even measure those welfare effects, you'd need some starting distribution of wealth by type. So like I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. It's just not what's typically done in urban. So you're right, but like, we're in a sense, we're kind of doing what everyone else has done. So, all right.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, I think in some sense, just thinking through these, is a good thing to do, even if it doesn't fit into the modeling framework, just as like a, discussion, because like I say, 60% of people do own homes. So we should at least think through how that might change the dynamics.
Yeah, I think one thing we could do, again, is just a back of the envelope, not maybe within the model, but like, what is your liability of, again, how much housing services are you going to rent over your lifetime versus the change in your asset if you owned, right? Because that we could do is, it's not going to be within the model, but we could sort of get at that to just show the differential impacts on young households versus old households, even the young owners.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Or sorry,
Lindsay, I had one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So There's this a paper by Ferdinando Monte at Georgetown, and he's looking at the dynamics in the transition going from fully hybrid or not fully remote in a fully remote situation that is forced by restrictions on COVID, and then as those restrictions get lifted, how cities move towards a fully in the office work type, or they stay in fully remote. And he compares, for example, places like New York City and Durham, and he shows that, you know, his model and both the data show that Durham is changing more rapidly towards working in the office than New York City, because the costs of commuting, for example, are much higher, and the cost of living near the business and business district center. So I was trying to contrast that with the conclusions of your model, and I think they are getting at different questions. But I was wondering if you think your model could say anything about that decision of going hybrid or not hybrid, or and whether, you know, that decision, which is I think taking exogenously here, that firms can take, can vary across locations depending on the share of people they have in different zones and the commuting costs that vary across locations.
Yeah, so I think they have the same sort of agglomeration economies that we have, but they use very different parameters. And so because they have sort of a higher value for those deltas, we played around with what those deltas should be, and we don't get into a multiple equilibria scenario. As I understood their paper, they're getting into equilibria where like the delta is so high that basically nobody comes in because it's not
Right.
worthwhile. What we're not modeling, that I need to read that paper a little more carefully, is what happened kind of during the pandemic and the outmigration during the pandemic of certain cities. Because we assume in New York, it looks like everybody's come back, but we're primarily just going pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. If you're telling me that maybe one of the reasons we see this overall outmigration that didn't bounce back during the pandemic, maybe that would be something you'd want to model, but we haven't really, that's not really what we're doing, except that, again, they're using pretty high values for those agglomeration economies. Mo, you have a thought. Go ahead. Mo wants to respond.
I'm probably just going to muddy the waters, but I was just going to clarify that there's kind of three ways to thinking about the increase in work from home. One is that it was like a change in preferences, either firm preferences, like a change in utility without related to wages directly. And Andre, who's on the call, he's worked very hard with his co-authors on that. That was one way to think about the change. A different way to think about the change is just that we got better at work from home. And Andra and I and Jesse have sort of taken that approach. And then just like, okay, if there was a shock to TFP from working from home, how large did that shock have to be to match the data that we observed? The third approach, which is by Monty and his co-authors, is just that there are multiple equilibria. And there was a shock that COVID pushed us out of where we were into somewhere else. And that we, in some cities, never really got out of that somewhere else. And I think so, you know, Andra and I, Jesse, we're taking our stand of it was a TFP change, but we're open to the idea that these other two explanations might matter and might be really important. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I think one thing, and maybe in the next version of the presentation, I'll present more on these sort of population shifts pre and post pandemic. In our model, the way we model it, it's just a big amenity change. I don't know that that's really true. Like, that's sort of like, long story. We started this paper hoping that we could explain all the migration across cities just with technology parameters. And we couldn't. Like, we could not explain those migration patterns without allowing that amenity change by city to happen. But I don't think that's super satisfying, because I don't really think, like, Salt Lake had mountains before the pandemic. It still has mountains. Like, I don't think a lot of the natural amenities changed that much. Now, the consumption amenities changed during the pandemic, right? So New York, like, nobody want to live in New York during the pandemic, because what's the